Hey everybody, my name is Dr. Scott Giacomucci. I'm a trauma therapist and educator in Pennsylvania. And in this video, I want to talk about trauma and relationships. I feel like this is such an important topic, and that pretty much every client I've ever worked with that's struggled with trauma at some point in their recovery and trauma therapy has talked about how it's impacted their relationships. So trauma can have an extraordinary impact on our relationships. Now, most trauma is what we call relational trauma, in that it takes place in the context of relationships, that we experience trauma because of another human being. Now, this might be a family member, this might be a friend, this might be a stranger or an employer, this could be anyone. But for the most part, trauma seems to take place within relationships. And relational trauma is often a bit more complicated than other types of trauma, in that there's the aspect of the relationship to try to make sense of. How could this person do this to me? Or how could this person act in a way that led to me feeling traumatized? That like experiencing disaster or tragedy when there's no one to blame oftentimes is a little simpler to work through than experiencing tragedy and disaster because someone intentionally harmed us. Now, that's a big generalization, but it's something that I've noticed in my work. So relational trauma can really impact our ability to feel safe in relationships. That it can impact our ability to trust. It can impact our sense of safety or a willingness to be emotionally present with someone we're in a relationship with. And it can really impact our ability to feel safe and comfortable with intimacy. And I think that goes for emotional intimacy as well as sexual intimacy. Something that probably doesn't get talked about enough is that when we experience sexual trauma, it really can impact our sense of safety, comfort, and pleasure when it comes to sex in romantic relationships. So there's a number of really common ways that trauma can impact our relationships. Trauma can put strain and stress on existing relationships for many different reasons. Maybe we come to have more emotional needs because we're struggling with emotional trauma, and we put that on the people that we're in relationship with, and it can really leave them feeling exhausted, or they might not have the patience or emotional energy to give us that we might really need, and that can strain a relationship. Trauma can leave us feeling like we can't put ourselves out there and create new relationships. And this is particularly tough if we experience relational trauma, and because of that, certain relationships that were important to us end, then we're left feeling alone and isolated, but we're afraid of abandonment or betrayal or more trauma, and so we struggle to form new relationships. It kind of leaves us stuck. So trauma and relationship challenges really go hand in hand. And then what often can happen is that we can reenact some of our relational trauma dynamics in new relationships. And you see this all the time. It's usually not something we're doing consciously, and certainly not something we're intentionally doing. But when our template and role modeling for relationships is abuse or neglect or betrayal or traumatic relationships, we tend to recreate that throughout our lives. This is particularly true when our first romantic relationship is abusive or traumatic. We tend to reenact that in future romantic relationships. Or when our initial relationships with our caregivers or parents are really abusive or neglectful or traumatic, that becomes internalized as the way we know how to be in a relationship. And we tend to recreate that unintentionally with our romantic partners. So this reenactment is particularly common with relational trauma. And it's something to really take a closer look at for any of us that have experienced relational trauma, to really get curious about if we're reenacting some of the dynamics of the trauma in our current relationships. And of course, this applies for romantic relationships, but this applies for all relationships. Are we reenacting trauma dynamics in our relationships with our friends, in our relationships with our families members, in our relationships in the workplace? There was even a research study that I peer-reviewed a couple years ago where they found that most people tend to reenact their family roles, the roles that they played in their family of origin, in their workplaces. And so there's a real likelihood of us reenacting relational patterns related to trauma with our boss, with our colleagues, with our supervisees, with leaders in the organization. And this is an important thing to take a look at. I think this is particularly true in relationships in the workplace where there's real power dynamics, that with our supervisors or with the leaders in an organization who have power over us, we may feel vulnerable with them, especially if we're someone that has experienced trauma that resulted in someone taking power over us, or someone else in our past that had power over us abusing their power. In that situation, it's pretty likely that we're going to project that relationship or transfer that relationship onto our supervisor or onto our teacher or onto a leader in our organization. And this happens all the time. The same goes for leaders in organizations and supervisors and managers themselves, that if we're not careful as leaders or supervisors, we might reenact traumatic relationships with the people that we're meant to be supporting and teaching and supervising and leading. So this one really goes both ways. And it's something that I think happens all the time in workplaces. I would actually argue that it's probably the source of the majority of conflicts and the majority of experiences that leave people feeling angry, hurt, or dissatisfied in the workplace. We call this transference or countertransference in psychotherapy. And this happens in the relationship with a therapist or with a professional, that we can transfer our feelings or internal experience or past relationships of trauma onto the therapist. And we can start to feel like the therapist is that person that hurt us in the past. And this is particularly common in therapy. Actually, in some forms of psychotherapy, this type of transference is the primary avenue of change and healing, that the therapist is trained to recognize when this is happening with their client and to handle it in a way that promotes healing and restoration and a corrective emotional experience, rather than handling it in a way that reenacts the trauma or neglect or the harm. So this reenactment of traumatic relationships is particularly common and important and significant to look at in trauma recovery and trauma therapy. Now, of course, there's many kind of behavioral responses to trauma or symptoms of trauma, symptoms of PTSD or complex PTSD that can also really impact our ability to be in relationship. The hyperarousal and anxiety and fear and reactivity that comes with PTSD can really disrupt our ability to be in relationships. If we're constantly looking over our shoulder, or we're constantly hypervigilant that our friend or our partner is going to harm us, it's going to impact that relationship pretty significantly. It's going to leave the other person feeling like we don't trust them. Or if we're constantly anxious in relationship, it's going to impact the quality of that relationship. If we're constantly overreacting and reactive in the relationship, it's going to leave the other person feeling hurt or misunderstood or not trusted again. If we're constantly numbing ourselves emotionally or avoiding, which is another symptom of PTSD, it's going to leave the other person feeling like we're not able to show up for them or we're not fully present in the relationship. Another way that trauma can impact our behaviors, it can leave us really feeling dependent or feeling alone, that we can fall on one end of the spectrum in being overdependent or codependent or enmeshed or trauma bonded with others, which puts a big heavy expectation on them. Or we can feel hyper independent, isolated, and not allow ourselves to be dependent or impacted by others. And either extreme is really going to prevent a healthy relationship from forming. So there's lots of different ways that the behaviors that trauma cultivates or leads to can also impact our ability to be in relationship in healthy ways. Now, if you are in relationship with someone that's a trauma survivor, either whether this is a romantic partner or a friend or a family member or a colleague, there's some simple things that you can do to best support that person. Now, understanding trauma is really going to help you better support this person to begin with. So the more you can do to educate yourself on trauma and how trauma impacts people and how trauma impacts relationships, the more you're going to be able to support this person. Now, being patient, being understanding, being aware of potential triggers for this person can help you really support them. Now, I'm not saying we need to always avoid triggers, because sometimes that's just unrealistic. But being aware of the other person's triggers can allow us to be more sensitive, to try to avoid some of those triggers in some situations, or even better, to support our loved one in working through the trigger so that they don't have to always avoid it, but that they can face it with our support. They can face it consciously, intentionally, with the safety that the relationship provides them. Another thing we can do to support someone struggling with trauma is we can encourage them to reach out to professional support. We can help them find a therapist, or help them find a support group, or help them find a community that understands trauma so they can engage in peer support. Maybe the most important thing that anyone could do to help a loved one struggling with trauma is to take a look inward and heal from their own traumas. That someone that's struggling with trauma is probably going to feel the most supported by their loved one joining in with them in the healing journey. And the only way to do that is to join in and deal with your own traumas. Not only is this going to allow a feeling of mutuality and collaboration and peer support, but it's also going to prevent some of those trauma reenactments I talked about earlier, and it's going to help your loved one feel less alone. It's going to validate and give them evidence that they're not the only one that's experienced trauma, and that they're not the only one struggling with trauma and working on themselves trying to heal from trauma. So I really encourage you to look inward and consider the things that you may have experienced that might have been traumatic or adverse experiences, and to do your own work on it and join in with your loved one as they work on their trauma. So in healing from trauma and relational trauma, it's really important to build transparency and open communication with each other. And that trust sometimes is going to take more time to build, and it's going to be developed gradually instead of all at the same time. And that healing can take place in any relationship. If we're wounded in relationships, then it makes sense that the healing is also going to come in relationships. And the healing might come in a romantic relationship. The healing might come in a relationship with a friend. The healing might come in a relationship with a mentor, with a supervisor, or a supervisee, with a therapist, or in a support group. But the healing is probably going to take place within relationships. So I really want to emphasize the importance of relationships in recovery from trauma. That as humans, our brains are really wired to find safety and emotional regulation through relationships, through groups, and through communities. And that trauma can really impact our sense of safety in relationships and groups and communities. But at the same time, these relationships, groups, and communities are essential for recovery. So I hope that you found this video useful. If you did, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel, to like the video, leave a comment and tell us what you learned, or what you found helpful, or what you think I forgot to mention in the video here about relationships and trauma. If you subscribe to our channel, you'll get notified about future videos related to trauma and trauma recovery and healing. And my hope is really that this video is helpful for anyone that's been struggling from trauma, or for anyone that is working with trauma survivors, helping them heal from trauma. Thank you.